Hello everybody, this is the Mighty Glue Stick and we're going to talk about goblins. One of the most diverse of the monstrous humanoids in Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder throughout the entire history of the game, right back to the white box set. So what is a goblin? What's the basic attributes of a goblin? They are around 3 to 4 feet tall, pointed ears, equally pointy teeth, jet black hair and skin that varies in hues from orange and brown to hues of green. They have beady black eyes and flat faces, and they are numerous and kind of mutagenic in that they vary quite a lot amongst individual goblins. You can recognize them by their basic traits, but goblin clans are extremely diverse and reactive to their environment, and take advantage of whatever they can to survive as best they can. They are consummate survivors, and if you go back in the history of the various lines of games where they come from, the various settings, their origins are as diverse as the goblins themselves. So I'm not going to cover a lot of where goblins come from, because that will quickly devolve into discussing each and every setting, such as Eberron or Forgotten Realms or Glorantha or Mystara. All these have different origin stories for goblins. There is a popular opinion that in the modern game, they were originally created from hobgoblin stock as spies and thieves, and that's fine, that's suitable. So you could say that they are a degenerate form created within goblin kind itself, not the base stock of goblins, as some people would assume that other goblinoids have evolved from, which originally was my thought, but it turns out that's not exactly accurate. So there are lots and lots of different types of goblins, and there have been, particularly in versions, the 3.5 edition of the game, where there was a lot of diversity in specific different types of goblins, and every other creature got multiplied a lot into different subtypes. There are lots of different types of goblins, and I'll cover some of the most interesting. For instance, in the Forgotten Realms setting, in the island continent of Chult, there are a type of goblin called the Batiri, who with green skin that in order to blend into their jungle surroundings, and they're particularly good at tracking and hunting creatures at night, taking advantage of their natural dark vision. They use short bows, crude short bows and spears, and they like to steal metal implements off human settlements because they don't generally smith metal themselves. And this is fairly true of most goblin activities. They don't generally engage in craftsmanship, crafting, or higher technology. In fact, they shun it. And in some settings, goblins have a fear or a superstition about the written word that has prevented them from passing on any knowledge other than basic survival to their offspring. What they do particularly well is they reproduce extremely quickly, and they survive in extremely hard conditions in whatever way they can, even to the point of cannibalism amongst other goblinoids, not typically within their own tribe, but they will eat other goblins of other tribes, rival tribes, and they will eat any available food source they can find. As long as it's organic, they'll find some way to survive on it. They don't really have any allies. They have a lot of masters, but if you could say that they have the allies in the wargs, which is the giant kind of dire wolves offshoot that goblins are known to cohabitate with and tame, or at least partner with, as riding animals. The wargs find this mutually beneficial, because if time gets particularly tough, the wargs may in fact turn on the goblins and eat them to survive. So they have similar interests. The individual personality of the goblins is bloodthirsty, cruel, vindictive, quick to anger, double-crossing, and generally just despicable. They are well known to be cowardly and devious in the extreme. In fact, they're synonymous with it. And this is pretty much, it goes across all of the goblin kinds, apart from possibly the Grod goblins. The Grod goblins were a sub-race of goblins that was separated from the rest of goblin kind because they were drawn into a demi-plane by an elven dragon. in a sort of a sub-story, this also led to what was known as the Goblin War that took place in the 1300s, Dale reckoning. Although, in actual fact, it was misnamed because goblins only took a small part in that. In fact, most of the antagonists were orcs. There were only a few goblins. But the Grod goblins were interesting because they spoke ancient Elven and were more civilized through this exposure to their elf dragon overlord and being separated from the rest of creation in this subplane of Grod, which they also developed a resistance to shadow attacks because this plane was in close proximity to the plane of shadow. Anyway, so in Forgotten Realms, there are many, many different tribes of goblins, and they are very diverse. The average weight of a goblin, if a 4-foot tall goblin, they weigh about 27 kilos or 60 pounds. Their skin color is yellow to red, although, as I mentioned, it can also be brown, orange, and all the way to green. They're short and agile, typically. They're stealthy, deceitful. They have pointy ears, and they tend to follow the Magubliet as their god. But recently, since the Spell Plague, Bane has become their main deity, with Magubliet and other goblin gods becoming exarchs of Bane, so sub-gods or demigods per se. There's lots of Subraces, and they favour temperate environments and plains, but they typically lair underground in caves and easily accessible caverns. They don't do a lot of mining or anything themselves. They take advantage of any structures that they can find to form their lairs, but they like to lair out of direct sunlight. This may also be ruins and things like that they favour. They also like to cohabitate close to other races that they can take advantage of and steal from. Anywhere where there's farming or relatively undefended settlements or old ruins of things nearby that they can occupy. They love to hang out in farming, on the outskirts of farming communities of larger humanoids, humans in particular, as of recent times, and basically steal whatever they need from the farmers and lair inside ruins and dungeons and crypts and cave systems. They will have relatively weird and twisting corridors leading to a central large chamber where they all live and sleep. Their environment is typically filthy, and you'll find that they cluster the females and the young and the old craftspeople together in this large central chamber, and that is where they basically do everything. So they don't have much of a concept of privacy. The only individual chambers will be places where they store things securely, or where their leaders live in relative isolation, separated from the rest, as a status symbol. But otherwise, goblins have no concept of privacy, and they also have no concept of fair play, honour, or such things as keeping your word. They just expect betrayal and anyone to use any dirty tactic they possibly can to win. That's inbuilt into their psyche, and that's how they raise their young. Their young are raised to take advantage of anything that they can to get ahead. They don't give them individual care. They need to compete for everything. And the mother basically doesn't favour any goblin offspring at all. They just essentially leave them food and things like that, and let the offspring sort it out amongst themselves. So the attrition rate of children, infants, is extremely high, and the females are basically cowed into breeding. They're kept pregnant all the time. So there is a great disparity amongst the sexes in the goblins, in that the women really are just kept as breeding stock. And quite often females that are exposed to outside cultures in any way will realize that they can actually have freedom from this. So the most independent goblins you'll find outside of a goblin tribe will be females who have escaped for some form of suffrage to get away from their goblin suppression and live free lives away from the rest of goblin kind. Occasionally you'll find other goblins too who are capable of learning and capable of understanding the concept of goodness and honour and fair play, but they have a natural inclination to having a very short fuse, a very short temper, and they naturally enjoy revenge. For a goblin, the best feeling in the world is getting one over somebody else, really. Bullying and revenge and assassination and sadism are inbuilt into their pleasure centers of their brain. So even the best goblin, when confronted with outright racism towards him, which is fully expected, can't help but react in a way which is violent, vindictive, cruel, and deceitful. Even the best goblin is going to find it extremely hard to resist the urge to take revenge on anyone who slights them. And they'll do that in any way that they can. Even the best of goblins has a cruel heart, is what I'm saying. Anyway, they are nimble and elusive. They're able to slip away from danger and squeeze through tight confines. In combat, goblins use advantage to sneak up on enemies and deal them blows from hiding and slip away before they can be retaliated against. They are natural masters of guerrilla warfare. They are surprisingly charming and wheedling when they need to be, despite their monstrous appearance. And they are also capable of masquerading as friends in order to lure a target into a situation where it can be ambushed by everyone else. And they gain some social standing by this, being the one that was able to fool, brave enough to confront, and clever enough to fool a larger humanoid into getting into a position where it's lost its guard and they can take it out. That's pretty much heroism as far as goblins are concerned. The leaders amongst goblins can be of other races. In fact, they typically are. It's a rare thing that a very strong goblin has risen up to take control of a goblin tribe for any length of time, because assassination is so common amongst their own kind. It will be typically members of a race of larger goblin kind, such as hobgoblins or bugbears, who will take over the leadership of a goblin tribe. And also orcs on occasion. An outcast orc can find itself in a relatively cushy situation leading a goblin tribe, but again, they have to be constantly on the guard for ambush, poison, having a knife in the back. They have a reputation for being dim-witted and evil, although they are cunning, extremely cunning, your goblin. They don't have much of a written language. In fact, as I've mentioned, some of them have a phobia of any sort of written word, seeing it as a magical thing which must be avoided and shunned. The magic that they do use is typically directly channeled through the gods or through demons or other such powers. They will take advantage of any sort of magic they find that is easy to use and has an obvious sort of on-off switch. But they're also curious and meddle in things that sometimes they shouldn't. So goblins are quite often responsible for unleashing things which have been locked away for eons, because they just simply don't understand the warnings which are posted around them. They haven't read anything. They just go in and prod at it thinking there might be something that they can take that will give them an advantage. And as such, they release things which they really shouldn't have, and scatter and don't deal with the consequences. Orcs and goblins are not related in Forgotten Realms, and most Dungeons & Dragons settings they are actually separated. Originally, goblins were simply described as small humanoid monsters, and they weren't clearly defined until much later on. These days, of course, they're much more defined. They live up to 62 to 80 years. They reached a maturity very young, 10 or 12 years of age is adulthood for a goblin. Pretty much females will breed as soon as they are capable, and males, if they've survived through their relative tumultuous youth, they basically become part of the warrior stock of the tribe and are responsible for providing food and any resources if they want to have access to breeding rights. Essentially, that's what they do it for. They don't give two tosses about the offspring that they produce. That's really up to the females to take care of the whelps, and they really are just herded into the central cavern and thrown food that they scrabble over and fight and hiss and backstab each other over to get what they need. So they're typically grasping and greedy, by their very nature, and goblins will wolf down their food, barely chewing it, and looking over their shoulder for the inevitable blade coming their way. Their mentality is pretty much a prison culture, that they are constantly looking over their shoulder for the next thing to either tromp on them, betray them, or double-cross them. Being bullied by bigger, stronger creatures has taught goblins to exploit whatever advantage they have. So their sheer numbers and malicious ingenuity is what they rely on. If they don't have a clear numerical advantage allowing them to swarm, they will instantly scatter. No goblin will go by itself into combat without at least 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or more other goblins around it, and they have this natural inclination to bunch up and swarm and mob larger opponents, in fact any opponent. If they can't get away with a quick knife in the back and then running away scot-free, they basically won't attempt it. If they can't approach and overwhelm somebody in large numbers to do with it as they wish, then they just won't get into that sort of combat situation. They'll use missile weapons or harry or lead them into trapped areas. While they're not quite as capable of setting ingenious traps as kobolds are, they've are very much one of the trap building races of the Dungeons and Dragons world, and goblins leave traps indiscriminately everywhere. More so than any other race, they don't really leave warnings for themselves that traps are there, so they quite often are victims of their own fellows' traps just because they've just built traps all over the place, and really it's up to each individual goblin to learn what the hazards of their environment are, because they don't care about others. So yeah, they'll leave pit traps and spike traps and all sorts of other simple physical traps around that are fairly well disguised and are left around thoroughfares and such that other larger races will obviously use. The goblins themselves will use rope bridges, and they'll climb along cavern walls and things like that. They typically won't walk right down the middle of a large cavern or such. They'll walk around the edges of it just naturally, and they stick to the shadows and rocks and cover at all times. Their natural walking gait is a skulk. They rarely walk at full height, and they generally sidle around with their head shifting and looking in all directions as they go, kind of like scuttling birds. They very rarely focus their attention on one thing all the time. They will be constantly looking over their shoulder and twitching and moving around furtively. That's how I pretty much portray a goblin. They have short, screechy voices. Their words are guttural. The language that they speak is typically based on a basic language, Gobliak, but otherwise known as Goblin, and they all share the same sort of syntax, although individual words amongst goblin tribes will be different. So they typically wear dark leathers soiled by bad hygiene. They are famous for having all sorts of weird, disgusting things in pouches and packs that they carry. They'll carry whatever food they can, and it's quite often quite gruesome. Their tastes range to muck and goo, really. They find humanoid food from more civilized races to be weird, bland, and overly spicy and exotic. For them, mold and rot and things are spices and such, and so they'll eat very, very strange and quite disgusting things. They consider maggots and vermin to be then ordinary food that they would eat. For them, a loaf of bread without maggots in it would be bland and not mature, if you see what I mean. So goblin cuisine is not exactly conducive to the health of the less hardy races. Goblins can withstand all sorts of plagues and diseases that would quickly wipe out anybody else. They live in conditions where everyone else in their society who's susceptible to those sort of things has died off long ago. So they can withstand bacterial and fungal infections, plagues, viruses, and that sort of thing relatively easily. Their agility is such that they set up scaffolding and things like that as main thoroughfares and things. So their bridges and things are typically rickety. They'll construct houses on poles. They'll climb up ropes and skittle across relatively frail and fragile structures. Spider webbing and things like that. They can clamber around old webs and things like that. Anything that will basically sustain their weight and won't fall apart immediately is fine for a goblin. They're quite agile in that regard. And they are quite adept at using missile weapons, and I would say one of their sports would be letting loose some small animal and throwing sticks and stones at it, namely for the cruelty, but also for the accuracy and their ability to throw a rock which will break a limb or slow down the animal, and they become the victor. So their natural inclination is cruel games of sport, and also they will throw rocks and things at each other or whoever is the sad target of their bullying for the day. That's basically what they do. So yeah, I like to portray goblins when they are not immediately being attacked or attacking player characters as an overwhelmingly intimidating group. So the players will realise that once they've been drawn into the lair of the goblins, that they are surrounded by goblins, and that it's going to be a very nasty fight to get out of there if things turn bad, and to realise that they can turn bad at any moment for any reason. So an unease when they're walking and dealing with goblins, an innate chaos and cruelty to the goblins, which makes it difficult to deal with them diplomatically. Not only that, but the goblins are ignorant and savage and very quick to anger and view things in the worst possible light at all times. So it is a challenge to maintain one's cool when dealing with the goblins. Plus, of course, their patron deity of Magublet or Bane drives them to conquest and taking what they want, and they see nothing wrong with killing at all. So there's that to deal with. So weaving them through, the player characters, through a network of traps, through corridors pocked with murder holes with goblins on the other side staring through with daggers and blades and things ready to stab them at a moment's notice, realizing that you're walking into literally a grinder of a trap where these little things can get at you and you can't necessarily get back at them very easily, that they'll scatter out of your reach, go into squeeze holes and drop down holes in the floor, or shimmy up ropes into the ceiling, that you're walking into a Swiss cheese maze of death. That is the feeling that I like to impart when talking about walking into a goblin's lair. So even at the highest level, they're going to be a massive inconvenience. At low level, they are a deadly threat. And that's pretty much how I like to portray them. Not only that, of course, but at the top of their rung of their society is some larger creature with an entirely different mindset, which is using the goblins like suicide troops, and for any reason at any moment they may set them against you, and the goblins will race to comply. So that's goblins for you. There's, as I said, there's lots of different subtypes and varieties and things which you can delve into. There's Dragon Magazine articles. Bruce Cordell did a good article for 3.5 edition about what sort of tactics that you could use against goblins, area attacks and great cleave and things like that. And there's a wealth of lore on the different goblin gods and the variant types of goblins, including the Nilbold, which is an old edition version of the goblin, which does everything in reverse. And so healing spells will damage the Nilbold, but physical damage will heal them. It's one of those things that Dungeon Masters used to pull on players way back in the day, which was quite cruel and unusual. So yeah, I would encourage you to come up with unique versions of goblins, develop your goblin voice and goblinoid words, and come up with interesting goblins which are removed from their society and have learned things from other humanoid societies, but are still at their heart cruel and merciless little bastards who will double-cross you at a moment's notice. And they're really a humanoid species which it's fun to hate in Dungeons & Dragons, and that's how I encourage you to portray them. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'll be back with more goblins later and carrying on also with the Abyss and other projects. Thanks for listening.